Hey y'all! In this video, we are going to finish up with the Pirate Epoxy Inlay project. Go outside and actually start carving and pouring the different colors of epoxy. Now, the sharper-eyed among you will notice that there have been a few changes to this project. Number one being this large vector out here to the outside, and this smaller rectangular vector here on the inside. This vector that I have selected now is my profile cutout vector. That's going to be the actual final size of the project after everything is completed. This vector here is for a surfacing toolpath that I use to surface the material before carving and pouring, and then used to surface the material after all of the epoxy layers had been poured. I also dug out a piece of material that I wanted to use for this project and went back into my job setup and entered the actual size of that piece of material. I've also made a few changes to the tool pathing over here, and that was done along with my order of operations and my pouring schedule. As I got into tool pathing and looking at this project a little bit closer, I discovered that I had a couple of different pours that may interfere with one another. For instance, I had pouring the dark gray for his hat and pouring the color of his beard scheduled to be poured on the same day. When I got to looking at it a little bit closer, I decided that these two colors were too close together. One of the facts I learned about this epoxy is it shrinks as it cures, and that can affect the surface height later on. So what you do is you overpour just slightly so that the liquid epoxy kind of bulges upward, and then let it shrink down as it cures. Well, when you do that, if you have a pocket here for his hat and a pocket here for his beard, if these are that close together, there's a possibility that I could overpour the beard so much that this color will overflow into his hat, into the wet epoxy there. And that is not a good thing. My point in this is that the pouring schedule changed to the point to where I had to add days just to be able to pour the dark gray for his hat on day 3, then come back and pour his beard on day 4. So the broader point in all of this is when you lay out your order of operations here, lay them out so that you are pouring multiple colors far enough away from one another that they won't interfere. You can see over here I have the dark gray for his hat and the Lux Bronze for the hilt of his sword being poured on the same day. These two are far away enough to where they won't interfere with one another. That's what I'm talking about. So, I had to rearrange the order of operations over here in my tool pathing, then reflect those changes in my pouring schedule, which then forced me to add days to that pouring schedule. I then also added an extra day to do the surfacing and profile cutout, as each one of these layers takes 24 hours to cure, and I can't pour the next color until these colors are cured. With that in mind, I also then had to generate new G-code. I did follow the pouring schedule, generated and saved new G-code for each of the days. If we go into day 1, this is the G-code for my first clear epoxy pour. And I can go into one bit of G-code and we can see right here that this is the only toolpath used in this file. And this file is for the 15-degree V-bit. If I jump ahead to day 3 and go into the V-bit G-code for this day's pour, I combined all 5 of these toolpaths into the one file. I have the brown for his shirt, the dark gray for his hat, the Lux bronze for the hilt of his sword, the green for his eyeball, and the gold for his earring, all being done the same day using the same bits. And the V-bit, the 1/8 inch end mill clearing pass, and the 1/4 inch end mill clearing passes all reflect this. That's how I changed the order of operations here. That's how I changed my pouring schedule. And that's how I changed the order of operations to make the project Carve go a lot smoother and to reduce the possibility of wet epoxy from one area from overflowing into the wet epoxy of another area. Now, I know I'm going to get questions on the surfacing toolpath. For the surfacing toolpath, I use my 2-inch Amana RC 2255 surfacing bit with a cut depth of 0.01 inches. I'm only going to remove that amount per pass. I'll set my Z0 up in here somewhere, you'll see why later, and make one pass to surface the entire piece. I'll then inspect and see if I need to make another pass, and if I do, I'll set my Z0 again and run the toolpath again. And repeat that process until the bit has surfaced it down to the appropriate level. The reason the vector is so big, if I highlight and turn on the toolpath, is I wanted the tool to make its changes in X completely off of the material. The toolpath will rapid my bit over here to this point. It'll drop down to the right height and enter the material here rather than dropping down into the material and then start cutting. So it'll do its initial plunge out here, move on to the material and make a pass, then come way off of the material, adjust over to the left in X, and go back up this direction. I wanted these X movements to be done off of the material. That's why I made the rectangle so big. I used this same surfacing toolpath to surface the material before I created the first carve. And in fact, that was the material I was surfacing in my earlier video on setting up work offsets and fixture offsets. Now, if you missed that video, I'll put a link to it in a card up here right about now. And I've also linked it down in the description box of this video. So let's go ahead, go outside, get on the CNC router, and I'll show you how I mounted the material and carved each day and poured each day's epoxy layers. This is the method that I use to mount the material every day for every carve. I use the painter's tape and CA glue method, and then you see me now inserting the dowel pins that I installed in my spoil board when I created the G59 offset in my previous video on work offsets and fixturing offsets. I did take the material off of the spoil board and into the house every day. This is also the procedure that I used for setting the Z0 with this very delicate 15-degree V-bit. I always run the VCarve toolpath first. I want as much support on that material as I can get. And running the V-bit toolpath first gives me a cleaner end result. Thin pieces and inside corners are less likely to chip out if I'm carving through a full sheet of material, rather than allowing that V-bit to cut along the edges of a pocket that's already been cleared out with the larger area clearance tool. With the 1/8 inch clearance tool and the 1/4 inch clearance tool, I was able to use my touch plate to set the Z0. That was something I could not do with that 15-degree V-bit because the tip is just too delicate. You'll also notice that I'm wearing gloves and a respirator while I'm carving this particular piece of material. More on that in just a few minutes, but basically I discovered that I have a sensitivity to this particular wood species, so I had to take steps to protect myself from it. And this was the result of the first day's carving. I cut out the entire pocket. I didn't waste time showing you the pouring of clear epoxy. But you'll see that I poured the clear and covered not only the pocket, but I also covered just about the entire surface of the material. That was both to give me a little bit of protection from the material, as I have a sensitivity to this material, but that was also to even out the color, and I'll explain that a little bit later on. Once again, I started with the V-bit first, then came back and used the larger area clearance tools after using the V-bit. I used my digital level each day to level the piece on my table, then mix up and pour the epoxy. You need to try to get your material as level as possible so it doesn't overflow off of the material onto the table, or even worse, all over your floor. And that can happen. I used a toothpick to go around especially the inside corners and make sure that epoxy flowed into those corners. Then took my torch and popped any bubbles. Day 3 is basically a repeat of day 2. VCarve the area to be poured that day, then go back with the larger area clearance tool and clear out the areas for that day. Now, something I have noticed about working with these epoxies is the colors tend to cure darker than the color you saw when you mixed and poured them. So that is something to keep in mind. I apologize for this video here. I was trying to get a different camera shot and this angle didn't work out very well. So I won't be using this in the future. Once again, the V-bit first and the larger area clearance tools second. And you see how far apart these areas are that I'm going to be pouring on this particular day. None should overflow into the other. Once again, using a toothpick to make sure I got epoxy down inside and there were no deep, large air bubbles in corners. Once again, I torch the air bubbles, and for the first hour, I torch every 10 minutes just to make sure that I get any air bubbles that may rise. Here you can kind of get some idea of how close that beard is to his hat. And if I had over poured one or the other, it could have been a real mess. That was my reason for splitting up those two areas into 2 different days of pouring liquid epoxy. I'm using a scale to weigh out the epoxy, and I will do a separate video on this later on. But suffice to say that with the epoxy being as expensive as it is, follow the manufacturer's instructions on mix ratios and get yourself a digital scale and weigh your epoxy. I have to say, these black diamond mica powders really worked excellent. Keep in mind, I'm using the same method to reattach the material every day. You can see towards the top of the material an area that I did not cover with clear epoxy. That is where I set my Z0 after the first day's pouring. This was by far the longest tool path of the entire project. Most of the others took a maximum of about 5 minutes. This was a total of about a 45-minute tool path because the 15-degree V-bit had to carve out most of the outlines. The larger area clearance tool didn't remove much. And this is the final day of pouring. This is all of the black outlines. Once again, went around, made sure I had all of the corners filled in. Then just generally spread it around and made a big mess. Surfacing day is the big day because that's when you get to see the result of all of the tool pathing and pouring that you've just spent the last week on. I ended up running that surfacing tool path 3 times, and there is the final result before sanding or finishing. While I'm not happy with a couple of colors, overall I'm very happy with the finished product. From this point on, it becomes identical to any other woodworking project. We're in the finishing stages now. I then began the finishing process using 150 grit sandpaper on my random orbit sander, then stepped up to 220 grit sandpaper, then 320 grit sandpaper. After once again breaking the edges after the last grit of sandpaper, I used some 91% isopropyl alcohol on a rag to wipe off any sanding dust that may have been left over after the sanding processes. I wiped down the entire project a total of 3 times with 3 different rags to remove any and all sanding dust before starting to spray the finish. For the finish, I gave the entire piece, front and back, 3 coats of a high gloss polyurethane, then waited 3 days, sanded back with 320 grit to remove any roughness, and then came back with another coat of the high gloss polyurethane. And here's the finished product after 4 coats of gloss polyurethane. Now, I'd like to, first of all, give a special thank you and a special shout out to Mr. Rob Sandstrom at Rob Sandstrom Designs. Thank you very much, Rob, for answering my newbie questions and helping me to source some materials I had a hard time finding. I really appreciate your help. Now, I've put a link to Rob's YouTube channel down in the description box, and I highly encourage you to go over, subscribe to his channel, and pay particular attention to his video on measuring and mixing the epoxy by weight rather than by volume. That was an invaluable resource. Thank you again, Rob. So I learned a lot of lessons in doing this epoxy inlay. Number one, I learned to pay particular attention to the order of operations, especially when it comes to how close some of these colors are on this inlay. The epoxy resin shrinks as it cures, so you have to slightly overfill the area with epoxy. Then as it shrinks, it flattens out. If you have 2 pockets too close together, it's very easy for one to flood into the other, and you'll end up with a big mess and probably have to carve those areas out again and start over. So pay attention and try to keep your carves far enough apart to where you don't have any danger of one overflowing into the other. Second would be practice on scrap. Now, I know I preach this a lot. If you follow me on Instagram or on Facebook, you know that I did an almost identical project on a piece of MDF. And that was for a few reasons. Number one, I wanted to verify I had the correct toolpaths and that those toolpaths would work. It was while I was doing that that I discovered I had a couple of toolpaths too close together to pour in one day. It also gave me an opportunity to get used to working with this epoxy material and learn the better ways of mixing and creating colors. That leads me on to something else. Take copious notes. Now, I didn't do that. So when it came time to try to duplicate some of the colors I did in my test, I got them a little bit wrong. I did not take notes, and I couldn't remember which color I used and how much of which color I used. So write everything down and be as thorough as you can. You can believe me, I am doing that now. Another thing I learned was to seal the entire surface of the finished project with the epoxy. Now, I'll put up a picture of my MDF practice piece right now, fresh off the machine, before I did any sanding or any finishing. And if you look closely, you will see a shadow line around the black outlines of the pirate. That's where the MDF absorbed that first clear pour. If I would have coated the entire surface with that clear epoxy, the surface would be nice and uniform. Now, after finishing this, it has reduced the appearance of that shadow line, but when you get up about this far away from it, you can still see it. That was one of the reasons why you saw me cover most of this piece of material with that epoxy resin. And the reason for that was threefold. One, again, to help hide any clear that may have been visible or absorbed around the edges of the pirate. Two, to protect me. As it turns out, I have a reaction to this leopard wood. Not everybody does. It just turns out I'm one of those people. It burned me like fire. So that helped protect me, where I wasn't handling the raw wood anymore. If you notice, I did leave one area up above the top here uncovered. I did not put any epoxy up above that area. That's where I set my Z0 after that first clear coat. The other reason that I went ahead and coated most of it with the clear epoxy was, depending upon the wood species you're using, it could be a very dense grain and it could be a very open grain. This leopard wood has a fairly open grain structure. And as you noticed in some of the video while I was pouring, that epoxy is pretty messy. Any drips or drops that end up out here may very well sink in, penetrate, and stain the material, causing me to have to surface it deeper than I want to get rid of that. So by protecting the whole surface, any drips or drops I may have spilled on the clear epoxy would get surfaced away, and I didn't have to worry about it. Another thing I learned is to re-measure the thickness of the material after surfacing. Now, I didn't do that, so when I created my profile toolpath to cut out the final project, I didn't account for the amount of material I removed when I surfaced the face. Consequently, my profile toolpath cut about 30 thousandths of an inch into my spoil board. So now I get to repair my spoil board. No big deal. That's what a spoil board is for, to take the brunt of the abuse. Now, I promised a couple of tips, and these are fairly simple tips. One is, when you mount your material, it's important that you use that same mounting technique for the duration of the project. Now, as you saw, I took this project off of the CNC and took it in the house every day after carving, poured inside the house in a climate-controlled room where the epoxy could cure. It's important that you get this material back in the correct location so you have correct X and Y alignment when you go to do the next carve. That's why I created that G59 fixture offset that I demonstrated in a previous video. And I put a link to that video down in the description box of this video. Using that G59 fixture offset made this entire project a breeze. I set it up before I ran my MDF test piece, and I used it for the MDF test piece and for the finished project in leopard wood. I set my XY0 one time, then used that fixture offset the rest of the time, and as you can see, I had no issues at all with my X or Y alignment. Now, I know there's no way I've answered every question you may have about doing multicolored epoxy inlays. So this afternoon at noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, I'll be hosting a live Q&A session where you can ask me any question you'd like about anything I've demonstrated in this video or any of the previous videos in this series. Again, that's today at noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, right here on my YouTube channel, and I've put a link to that live Q&A down in the description box of this video. I've also put a link to the playlist for all 4 episodes in this series. I'd also like to give a special shout out and thank you to all of my channel members. If you would like more information on how to become a channel member, just click that join button right next to the subscribe button, a panel will pop up and a video will play that'll tell you all about becoming a channel member here on my channel. So, I hope to see you this afternoon for the live Q&A session. And as always, whether you subscribe to my channel or not, whether you become a channel member or not, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to watch, and y'all take care.